Tonight, you'll hear some of the craziest hidden secrets ever revealed about ancient Egypt. Stories that don't just question the past, but the limits of what humans were capable of thousands of years ago. From tombs that were never tombs, to stones that weigh more than modern cranes can lift, and rituals meant to guide souls across dimensions. These are the mysteries Egypt never wanted us to solve. And it all begins with a single question. How did they move blocks weighing 70 tons without modern machines?
If you have a straight ramp, which is leading up to the Great Pyramid, if it's going to carry blocks right up to what will be the top of the Great Pyramid, you're looking, no gang of workers can haul a 20-ton block up a slope that's steeper than 10 degrees. So you're looking at a ramp which is going to extend roughly a mile out into the desert. Furthermore, that ramp is going to have to bear the load of very heavy megaliths to be carried up. Therefore, the ramp itself has got to be extremely strong in order to carry that load. And the problem is, where's the ramp? Where's the remains? There's nothing there on the Giza Plateau to suggest that. And so that's why this idea of spiral ramps has been proposed. Various other suggestions have been made. But the truth is, as everybody will admit, is that these are all theories and that nobody knows how the Great Pyramid was done. I get it. There is no doubt that large numbers of strong men can haul very large blocks of stone on the level. They can if they're on a horizontal surface. There are even images from ancient Egypt with hieroglyphs which show a kind of sled-like device with a very large statue on it. We might guess its weight at 50 tons, being hauled along by teams of workers, and on the front of the sledge an individual is standing there pouring water in front of the runners of the sled to make the sand slippery underneath it. And that would work. That would absolutely work horizontally. But the problem then becomes how you get those gigantic blocks much higher up in the pyramid. And I don't think the ramp theory works at all. And you have, for example, in the so-called King's Chamber, it is roofed by a series of granite blocks. And those granite blocks don't come from Giza, by the way. They were brought from 500 kilometers to the south. It's roofed by a series of granite blocks, and those granite blocks weigh about 70 tons each. And then there are other chambers above the King's Chamber, which most people don't get into. I've been into them. There's 5 chambers. They're called the relieving chambers, and each one of them is also floored and roofed by 70-ton granite blocks. And to get that massive collection of 70-ton blocks about 300 feet into the air to put them where they are now is not going to be done with wet sand, and it's not going to be done with sledges. And to do it with ramps, I think, is extremely unlikely.
Relieving chambers?
Yeah.
You said there's 5 of them?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4. The top one is 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5. And the first one there, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yeah, there's 5 chambers there. I've been in all of them. The one at the very top, under that gabled roof, that is one of the reasons why. Am I close enough to the microphone? I'm not sure.
No, we hear you. Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why Egyptologists feel confident in saying that it was the work of Khufu, because in that top chamber there is what is known as a royal cartouche. Each pharaoh, the name of each pharaoh was surrounded by a kind of oval device called a cartouche, and in that cartouche is roughly written the name Khufu. This is considered to be a quarry mark that was put on the block at the time the block was quarried and was never cleared away. You're looking at a cartouche on the left there, but that's not from Khufu's. Well, that is actually Khufu's cartouche, I think. But what you want to see is the one in the relieving chamber. Because that is the single piece of writing that Egyptologists rely on to attribute the whole of the Great Pyramid to Khufu. There's a whole other argument. How was that first discovered in the modern era? It was discovered by a British explorer called Howard Vyse. And Howard Vyse in the mid-1800s was a vandal of the worst kind. He blew a massive vertical hole in the southern side of the Great Pyramid. It just scarred it tore it to pieces with dynamite, and he dynamited his way into those relieving chambers as well. Now, Howard Weiss was suffering from real serious financial difficulties. He'd not made a significant discovery. He was £10,000 in debt, which was a really bad thing to be in the 1800s, and he had to come up with an amazing discovery. So there have been suggestions, which Egyptologists do not accept, there have been suggestions that Howard Weiss actually forged that cartouche, and he put it there in order to...
Just to come out and say, here's what I found.
Here's what I found.
Hey, this is why it's worth funding my next project.
Exactly, and it made his career.
How much fraud is there in archaeologists where they have to make up something for them to get credibility in their writing so they can sell more and get another raise or ask for more money when they're giving lectures and all this other stuff? How much? You know how they say there's 70% of art is fraud? How much fraud is there in archaeologists?
I would like to say not too much. I would like to say that. There is, of course, some fraud in archaeology. Human beings are human beings, and it can happen. But archaeology is a profession that polices itself pretty well. If a fraudulent claim is made, it is going to be exposed pretty soon. And I think particularly around world-famous monuments like the Giza monuments, I would be very surprised to see much example of fraud. Of course, I
just pulled up an article. Check this out.
Yeah, there it is.
Crazy.
Yeah, that's it. That's the cartouche in the relieving chamber. And that is the sole piece of written evidence which Egyptologists rely on to attribute the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, to Khufu. This is one of the ways in which the Giza pyramids are different from later pyramids. Giza pyramids are all attributed to the 4th dynasty. Go to the next dynasty, the 5th dynasty, and you're going to find pyramids like, classic example is the Pyramid of Unas at Saqqara, that's Unas. The interior of the Pyramid of Unas is completely covered in hieroglyphic inscriptions naming the pharaoh Unas. There's a massive amount of inscriptions.
Wow.
But the exterior of the Pyramid of Unas, as you can see there, is a mess. Now, you would have thought if the Great Pyramid was built 50 or 100 years before this, that they'd carry on improving. You wouldn't have thought they'd devolve, build something like the Great Pyramid, and then 50 years later or 100 years later build this mess.
So what happened?
Well, it seems like the ability to build pyramids was confined to a very specific period. And when they'd stopped it, they carried on building pyramids, but they weren't building them to the same standard, but they were doing something different. They were placing inscriptions inside them in detail, which do not exist in any of the Old Kingdom pyramids.
This is kind of like we were better at landing on the moon 60 years ago than today.
Kind of like that.
Yeah, makes sense.
But it's interesting because you normally do see a continual evolution, but in this case, you definitely see a devolution.
Which, in a sense, it doesn't make sense. When I say make sense, it doesn't make sense. Okay, so let me ask you this. Let's say Graham Hancock is given a unlimited budget and you're hired as the lead guy to go. I just looked up right now, only 10%, less than 10% of findings we've explored of the pyramid. That's what I just saw. If you were given an unlimited budget, open checkbook, a team that you get to put together, and ample time to go investigate everything you can about the pyramid, what would you do?
Well, the first and most important thing would be ensure that whatever investigation took place did not damage or destroy anything of great importance. This is something that's not often realized about excavations. When you excavate a site, you effectively destroy that site. So it had to be a very careful project with people who were very committed and in fact loving towards the Great Pyramid to undertake that project. But were it to be possible, were such a team to be assembled, who we could be sure would not cause unnecessary massive damage inside the Great Pyramid, then my first priority would be to investigate what is in those voids that are all being found around within the Great Pyramid. Are there other chambers in there? And if so, which have never been accessed ever by anybody since the pyramid was completed, I would like to know what's in them. That would be my goal. And I hope perhaps we will see that happen in the next 20 years.
Do you think there's anything revolutionary there? It's just kind of like we're just learning more about history.
Well, I suspect there might be, because it's clearly great lengths were gone to make these places very hard to access. Just like the shaft of the Queen's Chamber that I told you about, which goes, it's like an invitation. It's please investigate me, please explore me, please find out about me. But we are going to set you a series of hurdles that's going to make it very difficult to do that. You've got to earn the right to investigate me. And now that we have this scanning technology, we're getting to the point, at least in terms of our science, where we've earned the right, where we have the ability to ask the pyramid questions and to get answers from it.
And the deeper you go into Egypt's mysteries, the more it feels like the stones weren't the most important thing they built. Because behind all that impossible engineering, there was a belief that the real journey didn't begin in life, but after death. Here's Graham Hancock on what the ancient Egyptians thought awaited them beyond the tomb.
I think this is an area where I often get criticized, but I think when we look at a civilization and what it is and what it's achieving and why it's so special, when we look at our civilization today, we are fantastic at technology. We are brilliant at science. We can make the best possible machines. And we're a society that is built around production and consumption, and a society in which people define themselves in terms of what they own, what they possess, and what they produce. And it becomes a very materialistic society, a society that's focused on material things, where we define ourselves by our material possessions. Ancient Egypt had a totally different focus. Yeah, they were great at making material things, but that was secondary. Their main thing was, what are we here for? Why are we living this life? What happens to us when we die? They investigated that mystery more deeply than any other culture that I know of, and they were doing so right from the beginning of records.
And they were
Egypt.
documenting this journey to the afterlife.
Absolutely.
In hieroglyphs. And it's like, what were you documenting? Like, how do you know? Like, what were you trying? How did everyone agree on this particular myth or this story?
Unless there was some experience being brought to bear in it. It's one of the things that we point out in season 2 is that the ancient Egyptian notion of a leap to the sky after death, to the Milky Way, of a journey along the Milky Way, of encountering challenges and dangers and risks there, monsters that would block your path, gates that you had to know the password to get through. That idea is found all over the world. The path of souls. It's found all over the Americas. That
What do you think that they're trying to say?
Well, I think first of all, it's evidence of a remote common origin of this idea. It's when it's found amongst cultures all around the world that apparently had no contact with one another and are often separated by hundreds or thousands of years. The same idea is found about what happens to us after death. The only reasonable explanation I can come up with is that they've all inherited this idea and then developed it in their own ways from a remote common source. And that's one of the main reasons that I'm curious about the possibility of a lost civilization, that these spiritual ideas are found all around the world. And they involve the journey of the soul after death and a leap to the heavens. And sometimes it's called an underworld, but really it's set in the sky. And this journey that takes place where you are judged on what you've done with your life. This is something else that we avoid in the world today, is taking responsibility for our own lives. The ancient Egyptians required you to take responsibility for your life. And if you did not do so, the outcome after death would not be good. You had to celebrate the gift of life. You had to realize the incredible gift that you had been given. And one of the opportunities of that gift is the opportunity to accumulate wisdom. And that's one of the things, hopefully, that we all do as we get older, is get a bit more wisdom and a bit more understanding. But in the case of ancient Egypt, that idea is developed over 3,000 years, and it's essentially the same at the beginning as it is at the end. That the soul, that death is not the end. This is the conclusion of a society that put its best minds at work for 3,000 years on this problem. The death is not the end. We may think it is. Scientists may tell us it is. But when a scientist says death is the end, there's nothing more, we're just physical bodies, and when the light goes out, it goes out forever, that's actually not a scientific fact. That's not something that's been investigated or can be investigated.
Consciousness itself is so confusing. Just consciousness, just like, what is it? Why are we conscious? What is it local, or are we tuning into consciousness? And when you die, where's that go? Where's that energy go? Is the soul a real thing? Like, what is the essence of life? What is the essence of human life and human consciousness? Those are perplexing questions.
They're very perplexing questions, which actually are of great significance to every one of us. Yeah, I mean, suppose death just is the end, then that's a way not to have to take too much responsibility for our lives, for the impact that we've had on others, for the pain that we may have caused, or for the joy that we may have caused. If death's the end, there's no up or downside to that, whatever we do. But from the ancient Egyptian point of view, death's not the end, and you have been given the precious gift of life. What did you do with it? And there are moral aspects to that question. There's these 42 assessors, they're called the negative assessors, who ask the soul of the deceased questions about what they did in life. And those are all moral questions. They bear some relationship actually to the Ten Commandments. But there's another question which is called the weighing of words, and that question is, what did you do with the gift we gave you? We gave you the gift of the human life. We gave you the gift of the opportunity to love or to hate, at your choice. We gave you the gift to live in a human body, to have this incredible consciousness, to be able to integrate all kinds of information from all kinds of spheres. What did you do with it? Did you leave the world a better place or a worse place than when you came into it? Did you hurt and damage and cause pain to others consistently out of wicked intent, not accidentally but deliberately causing pain? And there are human beings who do that. For the ancient Egyptians, that kind of behavior meant an introduction to Amit, the eater of the dead. And Amit is displayed in the judgment scene. He's a creature, part hyena, part lion, and he sits there, and certain souls do not go on. Their journey ends, and it ends because of the choices they made during life, and because they never took responsibility for what they did.
Well, it kind of makes sense, a natural selection of the souls.
And if the Egyptians built for the soul, not for the body, then maybe the pyramids were never meant to be tombs at all. Graham Hancock has been challenging Egyptologists for years, arguing that the Great Pyramid wasn't a grave, but something more like a machine, a portal designed to send the soul somewhere beyond this world.
I'm in conflict with archaeology here, but I'm certainly not the only one, because the notion that the Great Pyramid is a tomb and only a tomb, which is what archaeology teaches, in my view, is absurd. It's well known that no burial of any pharaoh was ever found in the Great Pyramid, or for that matter, in any of the 100 pyramids in Egypt. Some of that can be down to tomb robbery, but in the case of the Great Pyramid, it was completely closed and sealed until Arab raiders under Caliph Mamun broke in to the Great Pyramid, and they found it empty. They were expecting to find enormous treasures and wealth, and instead they found it a completely empty building with nothing inside it at all. Of course, there are many other unexplored areas of the Great Pyramid. Remote scanning is now showing that there are huge, as yet uninvestigated cavities within the Great Pyramid, huge chambers. The best known feature of the Great Pyramid inside is the Grand Gallery, and it looks like there's a second Grand Gallery above it within the pyramid. That shows up in scanning. Nobody's been able to get in there yet, but it's not going to be an impossible technological feat to do so. I think rather than being at the end of the study of the Great Pyramid, I think we're just at the beginning of the study of the Great Pyramid. And little by little, if we are worthy, it will reveal its secrets to us. I think that's what it's intended to do. But it's not a tomb. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. For very, very simple reasons. When you know that monument, when you see it, when you confront its 6 million tons, when you confront its incredible precision, when you confront the already known corridors and passageways within it, the notion that this was built in 23 years is absurd. And yet, if the notion that it is the tomb of Khufu is correct, and if that's all it is, then it had to be built in 23 years, because that was the length of his reign. I regard that as impossible. And anybody with structural engineering experience, like my great friend Robert Boval, also regard it as impossible. More likely, it's a project that took hundreds of years to complete, and maybe thousands. I think that there's no doubt that parts of the Great Pyramid were completed and finished by the ancient Egyptians. I don't seek to take it away from the ancient Egyptians, but I think they were inheriting a very ancient tradition, and they were completing a monument that already stood in basic form on the Giza Plateau. I felt from the beginning that the three ground platforms on which the three Great Pyramids stand are far older than the pyramids themselves, and they represent an epoch that the ancient Egyptians called Zep-Tepi, the first time. And they do so astronomically. They do so in terms of astronomical connection to Orion's belt, just as the Great Sphinx does so in terms of the connection to the rising sun on the equinox, which at one time was housed by the constellation of Leo. And that moment when the three stars of Orion's belt are due south on the meridian at dawn on the spring equinox is also precisely the moment that the Great Sphinx is looking at the constellation of Leo, 12,500 years ago, not 4,500 years ago. 4,500 years ago, the stars of Orion's belt don't match up. And 4,500 years ago, the Great Sphinx was looking at the sun rising against the background of the constellation of Taurus. But we have a lion-bodied monument representing a celestial figure that we call the constellation of Leo, and that many ancient cultures called the constellation of Leo. And of course, immediately, huge argument from Egyptologists, from archaeologists who say, no, the Greeks or the Babylonians, late Babylonians, discovered the constellations of the zodiac. Nobody had recognized them before that. Complete bullshit, complete rubbish. Ancient cultures exposed to the drama of the skies in a way that we are not, couldn't possibly have failed to observe the 12 zodiacal constellations, which happen to be the constellations that lie on the path of the sun. If you observe the annual course of the sun, you will see during the months of the year that it rises against the background of each one of those constellations. But over a much longer period, when your marker is the spring equinox, you find that it's going backwards through the zodiac. And it gives us a very precise way of astronomically dating a time that was very important to the ancient Egyptians. Again, I think it's important for people to get this, that it is impossible to it's possible to use megalithic architecture, which is going to endure forever. You know, there's that saying that time fears the pyramids because they just last on forever. And to use astronomy to spell out a date very precisely, and that's what happens at Giza. We have many other monuments all over the world, which may have been built. The example I usually give is one of the Gothic cathedrals in Europe, built in the 12 or 1300s. But much of the symbolism is devoted to the age of Abraham, which takes you back, Ur of the Chaldees, to about 2000 BC. So the notion that a monument might choose to memorialize a very ancient date doesn't have to mean that that monument was built at that ancient date. It can be referring to that ancient date and saying, to us, the ancient Egyptians, that date was very important. And I'd be willing to stop there if it wasn't for the erosion patterns on the Sphinx.
Yeah.
Which
you have water damage on the
water damage, the exposure of the Sphinx to thousands of years of heavy rainfall. That was no such rains were on the Giza Plateau 4,500 years ago, but they certainly will when you go back to the end of the last ice age. So it looks to me like the Sphinx and the megalithic temples beside it, the so-called Valley Temple, the mortuary temples on the Giza Plateau. There are elements on the Giza Plateau, in my view. It's much better to come to the conclusion that they were actually made 12,500 years ago. And there are other elements which are memorializing the date of 12,500 years ago.
The implications of what you're saying are profound, because the procession is a 26,000 year process.
Yeah, that's right.
And for a culture that we now consider primitive, I agree with you, I think it clearly was not at all primitive, but to understand the vernal equinox.
Let's be clear on that. No way on God's earth can we call the ancient Egyptians primitive.
Well, we can't build what they built, so
And this was a highly sophisticated culture, and it was a culture, as it emerges into historical recognition, as it becomes what they call archaeologically visible around 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago. It's already fully evolved. They're doing their best stuff right at the beginning. And they are, from the beginning, memorializing much more ancient times. Zep-Tepi, the first time, which I and my colleagues think correlates closely with the date that we call 12,500 years ago, or 10,500 BC.
But if what you're saying about the Sphinx and the pyramids are correct, and that the Sphinx was, for example, actually meant to depict Leo, which was the constellation which represented the vernal equinox shift around that period.
Yeah.
That represents such a precocious, advanced astronomical knowledge. That's macro, it's cosmic scale knowledge.
Yeah.
That we just don't have today.
It's
And
knowledge,
it's
knowledge
so
that
fascinating.
requires scientific observation over a long period of time, particularly when you're actually going to create a marker of that on the ground. And I think it's really important that I pay tribute to Robert Bauval, because it's Robert Bauval, close friend of mine, great colleague of mine. Unfortunately, he's been very ill for the last several years. But Robert is the person who established and found the Orion correlation theory, for which he came into such vicious and vile attacks from Egyptologists, simply for noticing that the pattern of the three pyramids on the ground resembles the pattern of the three stars of Orion's belt, and then tracking back through precession to find the time when it actually absolutely matches. And that's about 12,500 years ago. And Robert and I worked together on the whole mystery of the Sphinx, but I would not be here in any way able to talk about the Orion correlation if it had not been for the absolutely fundamental foundational work of Robert Bauval. And I finish this by saying I also want to pay tribute to Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University, geologist, professor of geology, one of the few mainstream academics who's been willing to stick his neck out and say, as a geologist, when I look at the weathering patterns on this monument, it's not 4,500 years old. It's more like 12,500 years old. Again, Robert Schoch has come in for horrendous attacks from the archaeological community, but he's had the guts to stick it out. And before him, John Anthony West, who's passed away in 2018. It was John who first brought Robert Schoch to the Giza Plateau. So the ideas I'm expressing now have a lineage, and I may be the person who's writing them down. But they're not ideas that I've invented.
And by the way, I think it's important to present to the audience that modern Egyptology is sort of a product and gated by modern Egyptian Ministry of Culture. And we're here, actually, we have Yes Theory present. They're amazing. They did a collaboration with you earlier this year.
Yeah.
And we also have your amazing wife, Santha.
Yeah.
We have Kate and Laura as well. And Amar over here is Egyptian, and he actually, maybe his proto Yes Theory experience that ended up kind of convening him with everybody else was he wanted to be the first person to, one of the first people to climb the pyramid.
Only to realize
that Graham had already done it, and seen that his grandfather had an insignia, and he had done it too.
My grandfather's graffiti at the top of the Great Pyramid. Yeah, I've been lucky to climb the Great Pyramid several times.
I've climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times.
What?
And 2 of those climbs were legal. Of course, there was a time when anybody could climb the Great Pyramid, but here's my little anecdote. Santha and I together found at the top of the Great Pyramid, on the south side, overlooking what used to be the Boat Museum, on one step down from the top, we found the name initial P, Hancock, 5th of April, 1916. Well, my grandfather was Philip Hancock.
No.
Yes, and he was in Egypt. He was in Egypt during the First World War.
Are you serious?
But I still couldn't be 100% sure it was him, and at that time my dad was still alive, and he had my grandfather's diaries, which were little things, little diaries, dozens of them. And I went through to the date given, and I opened that page, and I saw just one line, and it said, "Climbed Great Pyramid today."
No way!
Oh my God.
That's crazy.
That was my granddad.
But you're absolutely right on the comment that there's like the current government, the current people, the governing body for antiquities and tourism in Egypt. They have been, Zahi Hawass has been this one guy that is like fully monopolizing what narrative comes out about Egypt and about how things worked back then. And it's like, it feels like he's just refusing to die. He's like pretty old.
I'd like to add a comment to that. Zahi and I have had a long relationship.
From his signature fedora to his discoveries at the Giza tombs and Valley of the Golden Mummies, Egyptologist Dr. Zahi Hawass is clearly a passionate promoter of ancient Egypt.
I've known Zahi since the mid-1990s. And actually, for many years, that relationship was quite positive. It certainly wasn't negative. But we had a falling out in 2015. And I said some very harsh words to him at the time. And looking back on them in retrospect as the years passed by, I began to feel I'd been unfair to Zahi. Not so much that Zahi'd been unfair to me, that I'd been unfair to him. And I've reached the point in life now where I would like to remove all bitterness and past conflicts from my life. I don't want to be in conflict with other people, if at all possible. So I reached out to Zahi earlier this year and told him that I would like to meet up and have a conversation, see if we can make peace.
Did you meet up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Was it good?
It was great.
Really?
Santa and I had dinner with Zahi and with Zahi's son Kareem.
Yeah.
It was a very enjoyable dinner. Zahi is an entertaining and amusing speaker.
Did you stay away from your semantic disagreements? Did you say?
Well, no, I told him, I apologized.
Okay.
I made an apology to Zahi. And by doing so, I lifted the burden off my back. And I tried to do this with people who I have been unfair to and been unkind to. I want to put that right as much as I can before I leave this physical body for whatever happens.
Hopefully
next.
that's not for a
I don't
long
want to
time.
carry a burden of too much bitterness and bad feeling and baggage.
That's very noble of you, but did you say, Zahi, I think that the pharaonic headdress put on the Sphinx was after, the original base, and it was actually Leo?
Zahi knows I think that. The argument is that the Great Sphinx was originally a lion. Totally a lion, not just a lion body with a human head, but a lion body with a lion head.
So the pharaoh aspect is modern.
Yes, originally it was the prehistoric Sphinx was a lion, and then the lion head became heavily eroded and damaged as thousands of years passed, and in the time of the pharaohs it was transformed, it was cut down and remade into the human head that we see on it today, wearing the classic Nemes headdress of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. Zahi and I may have some interesting collaboration in the future.
Interesting.
Where it will be an agreement to disagree.
Cool.
Where he will have the opportunity to strongly put his point of view, and I will have the opportunity to strongly put mine.
Amazing.
But we won't do that by smearing and insulting each other.
Amazing.
We won't do that by trying to cut each other down with ad hominem attacks on each other. We'll do that in a friendly way.
Does he have any first principles arguments against the limestone damage, water erosion damage?
Well, yes, Zahi and all Egyptologists don't accept that.
But because what's the argument against it? Not accepting it
I've
seems
never
dogmatic.
understood what the argument is. Clearly, it's never persuaded me.
Okay.
But perhaps if I can have more dialogue with Zahi, I'll understand it better, and maybe I'll be able to persuade him a little more to my point of view.
Yeah.
That there are issues around the Sphinx and around the pyramids which have not been properly investigated.
Yeah.
Due tribute to Zahi, he is. Undoubtedly spent his entire working life focused on the archaeology of the Giza Plateau and on the archaeology of Egypt in general. This is a man with an enormous amount of experience in this field. This is a man who has had access to every important structure and monument in ancient Egypt. In other words, he is a fountain of knowledge on the subject. And I don't want to dismiss fountains of knowledge. I want to see what I can learn from Zahi, and I hope that he might learn something from me as well, and we might end up in a place where there is respectful disagreement, and we can openly discuss the mysteries of the past. That's what I would hope to get to.
That sounds beautiful. Have you ever seen the movie Stargate?
Long time ago.
Kurt Russell movie.
Yeah.
I
have seen it.
There's a portal.
Yeah.
It's near the pyramids of Giza.
Yeah.
But I look at a lot of your work, and when it comes to the pyramids themselves lining up with Orion's Belt has always, across many cultures, been the place of ascension of souls.
Absolutely, it is here in North America, and in Central America, and in South America. The path of souls, that idea that on death our soul makes a kind of leap up to the heavens and then makes a journey along the Milky Way, and that journey is full of challenges and difficulties, on which we will be assessed for the use we made of the incredible gift of life. That idea is found all over the world. It's a universal idea, and it's one of the reasons why I propose that there's been a forgotten episode in human history, that we are looking at a legacy of an idea that was passed down to many later cultures from a remote common ancestor, going back to the end of the last
And
Ice
even
Age.
if you look at the king's shaft lines up with Orion, and the
Certainly
queen's
does,
shaft
yeah,
lines
yeah,
up with
yeah.
Sirius,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So it's this really interesting, precise alignment
yeah,
with
yeah,
constellations
yeah.
that.
The shafts of the king's chamber don't point at Orion, but one of the shafts of the
Okay.
queen's chamber does.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
And but
Let's be clear.
Yeah.
No king was ever buried in that chamber. These are all modern names that
Sure.
have been given by Egyptologists to these chambers
Sure.
to manifest their theory about why there's so many chambers inside the Great Pyramid. But we have no idea what the ancient Egyptians or anybody else ever called them in the past.
do you have a best guess as to what these were ritualistically used for, given their alignment?
Given the intense focus of the ancient Egyptians on the mystery of life after death,
Yeah.
on the mystery of life and on the mystery of death, actually, what happens to us. Most modern scientists of a very so-called rational persuasion, who believe that everything can be solved with weighing, measuring, and counting, will tell you, almost as though it's an absolute fact, that they've somehow established through experimentation that the soul, there is no such thing as the soul, and that it does not survive death. Of course, this is not a fact. This is a statement of a religious belief on the part of those scientists who view any such thing as mystical and nonsense. There is no experiment that could be done. Frankly, it's a mystery. None of us know. None of us know. None of us have a clue what happens. Maybe the so-called rational scientists are right. Maybe we are just meat robots, meaninglessly living out our existence here on Earth, producing and consuming. Maybe that's all we are. It could be, but I don't think it is. And the ancient our society pays no attention to these mysteries. The ancient Egyptians, that was their focus for 3,000 years, and they came to very, very, very definite conclusions about it. And those conclusions, I think, are very deep and very weighty and worth considering. And it's fascinating that the same idea is found all around the world. I get it why many different cultures might believe in life after death. The argument for that is people delude them. The rational scientists' argument for that is people delude themselves into believing there's life after death because they don't like the idea of coming to an end. But it's much more specific than that. It's not just life after death. It's this leap to the Milky Way. It's this journey through what is called it's strangely, it's called an underworld, but it's also in the sky. It's this journey through it. It's the challenges and ordeals that the soul will face along the way, where he or she will be held to account for the life they have lived, for that very specific set of notions to turn up all around the world. That's not an accident. That is a result, I believe, of a shared common influence. This is something else that archaeologists, I think, don't really get. I think what's missing is an archaeology of ideas, and that ideas can live and can be passed on through stories, through traditions, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and they can remanifest again and again. So you can get cultures that are separated by not just thousands of years, but also thousands of miles, who are still manifesting these ideas. For example, the ancient Maya in Central America, and we go into this in one of the episodes of season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, with a great archaeologist who doesn't hate me, you know, he agrees that this is a worldwide tradition. It's a very, very curious thing.
And there's this common trope too. You have King Judea of Sumeria saying that in a dream he was given this lapis lazuli, these tablets, saying that he has to build a temple with these specific astronomical alignments. You see the same thing with Pharaoh Thutmose in Egypt. You see the same thing with Aztec leaders, with Nebuchadnezzar. This sort of, you know, idea of you get this kind of download, or you have this divine connection, and then you must build this temple with these specific astronomical alignments. So I think that does point towards something having to do with the afterlife or some sort of ascension portal. I was even reading Ptolemy. Ptolemy, you know, is proto-astronomy. He's sort of like the in-between of like the astronomy we have today and, you know, whatever we had in the past. And he's writing in 100 AD in Roman times. And he's saying that the, you know, soul's ascension path is through Orion's belt. And
That's right. The leap is always to Orion's belt. That's another of the common factors in this idea around the world tour, because Orion stands by the Milky Way. From there, you're on the Milky Way. Then you make your journey.
So are you getting to some sort of more true proto-architecture to religion that involves these sort of oral traditions passed down that cuts across geography?
Look, I'll give you two examples. I've tried to explain it. It's best done graphically, really, for this to be understood. The phenomenon of precession is because the Earth is the viewing platform. I try to explain it in this way, from which we observe the stars, and because the Earth wobbles very slowly on its axis, and because that wobble unfolds a complete cycle in just under 26,000 years, the effect for us as observers is that the star's orientation in the skies gradually changes, and the rising time of those stars in relation to the sun gradually changes, and the pole star gradually changes because the extended north pole of the Earth is wobbling, and will sometimes point at empty space and sometimes point at other stars. Ours is Polaris, but it's been other stars in the past. So this is a very complex, very sophisticated process which requires detailed observation. Now, as I've said, using precession and monumental architecture, the ancient Egyptians have built an enormous statement on the ground that speaks to the date that we call 10,500 BC, astronomically. It speaks to that date, about 12,500 years ago. Then jump over to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Mm-hmm. Look at Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. Look at the very interesting symbolism on that pillar, which includes a scorpion, which includes a vulture with outstretched arms, which includes a circle, which we believe resembles the sun on the wing of that vulture. What we find is that is very persuasively an astronomical diagram of the sky at the summer solstice 12,500 years ago. And the sun is on the arm of Sagittarius, is the constellation that we think is represented by that vulture figure. The fact that we call it Sagittarius, other cultures can call it other things and symbolize it as other things. But the fact is that the shape of that constellation is what is reflected on that pillar. And using precession, it marks out again that same date that the ancient Egyptians called the first time. And that's interesting because Pillar 43 in Enclosure D has been dated to 11,600 years ago, but it's marking a date more than 1,000 years before that, 12,500 to 12,800 years ago. So that tells us that whoever built Göbekli Tepe, that previous date was as important to them as it was to the ancient Egyptians.
And if the pyramids weren't what we were told, then what about the guardian that stands before them? The Great Sphinx of Giza has always watched in silence, but Graham Hancock and Lex Fridman think it's hiding a secret even older than Egypt itself, a truth carved in stone but erased in the timeline.
This again is where you come to a series of mysteries which are perhaps best expressed on the Giza Plateau in Egypt with the three great pyramids and the extraordinary megalithic temples that many people don't pay much attention to on the Giza Plateau, and the Great Sphinx itself. This is an area of particular importance in understanding this issue.
Well, can you actually describe the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids and what you find most mysterious and interesting about them?
Well, first of all, the astronomy. And here I must pay tribute to two individuals, actually three individuals in particular. One of them is John Anthony West, passed away in 2018. He was the first person in our era to begin to wonder if the Sphinx was much older than it had been. Actually, he got that idea from a philosopher called Schwaller de Lubicz, who'd noticed what he thought was water erosion on the body of the Sphinx. John West picked that up, and he was a great amateur Egyptologist himself. He spent most of his life in Egypt, and he was hugely versed in ancient Egypt. And when he looked at the Sphinx and at the strange scalloped erosion patterns and the vertical fissures, particularly in the trench around the Sphinx, he began to think maybe Schwaller was right. Maybe there was some sort of flooding here. And that's when he brought Robert Schoch, the second person I'd like to recognize, geologist at Boston University. He brought Schoch to Giza, and Schoch was the first geologist to stick his neck out, risk the ire of Egyptologists, and say, well, it looks to me like the Sphinx was exposed to at least 1,000 years of heavy rainfall. And as Schock's calculations have continued, as he's continued to be immersed in this mystery, he's continuously pushed that back. And he's now, again, looking at the date of around 12,500 years ago, during the Younger Dryas, for the creation of the Great Sphinx. And then, of course, this is the period of the wet Sahara, the humid Sahara. The Sahara was a completely different place during the Ice Age. There were rivers in it, there were lakes in it, it was fertile, it was possibly densely populated, and there was a lot of rain. There's not no rain in Giza today, but there's relatively little rain. The next person, not enough rain to cause that erosion damage on the Sphinx. The next person who needs to be mentioned in this context is Robert Bauval. Robert and I have co-authored a number of books together. Unfortunately, Robert has been very ill for the last 7 years. He's got a very bad chest infection, and I think also that Robert became very demoralized by the attacks of Egyptologists on his work. But Robert is the genius. And it does take a genius sometime to make these connections, because nobody'd noticed it before, that the 3 pyramids of Giza are laid out on the ground in the pattern of the 3 stars of Orion's belt. And skeptics will say, well, you can find any buildings and line them up with any stars you want, but Orion actually isn't any old constellation. Orion was the god Osiris in the sky. He was, the ancient Egyptians called the Orion constellation Sahu, and they recognize it as the celestial image of the god Osiris. So what's being copied on the ground is the belt of a deity, of a celestial deity. It's not just a random constellation. And then when we take precession into account, you find something else very intriguing happening. First of all, you find that the exact orientation of the pyramids as it is today, and pretty much as it was when they're supposed to have been built 4,500 years ago, it's not precisely related to how Orion's belt looked at that time. There's a bit of a twist. They're not quite right. But as you precess the stars backwards, as you go back and back and back, and you come to around 10,500 BC, 12,500 years ago, in the Younger Dryas, you find that suddenly they lock perfectly. They match perfectly with the 3 pyramids on the ground. And that's the same moment that the Great Sphinx, an equinoctial monument, aligned perfectly to the rising sun on the spring equinox. Anybody can test this for themselves. Just go to Giza on the 21st of March, be there before dawn, stand behind the Sphinx, and you will see the sun rising directly in line with the gaze of the Sphinx. But the question is, what constellation was behind the Sphinx? And 12,500 years ago, it was the constellation of Leo. And actually, the constellation of Leo has a very Sphinx-like look. And I and my colleagues are pretty sure that the Sphinx was originally a lion entirely, and that over the thousands of years, it became damaged, it became eroded, particularly the part of it that sticks out the head. There were periods when the Sphinx was completely covered in sand, but still the head stuck out. By the time you come to the 4th dynasty, when the Great Pyramids are supposedly built, by the time you come to the 4th dynasty, the head of the lion, original lion head, would have been a complete mess. And we suggest that it was then recarved into a pharaonic head. Egyptologists think it was the pharaoh Khafre, but there's no real strong resemblance, but it's definitely wearing the Nemes headdress of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. And we think that that's the result of a recarving of what was originally not only a lion-bodied, but also a lion-headed monument. It wouldn't make sense if you create an equinoctial marker in the time of Khafre, 4,500 years ago, and the Sphinx is an equinoctial marker. I mean, it's 270 feet long and 70 feet high, and it's looking directly at the rising sun on the equinox. If you create it then, you'd be more likely to create it in the shape of a bull, because that was the age of Taurus, when the constellation of Taurus housed the sun on the spring equinox. So why is it a lion? And again, we think that's because of that observation of the skies and putting on the ground, as above, so below, putting on the ground an image of the sky at a particular time. Now, the fact that the Giza Plateau, it's a fact, of course, that Egyptologists completely dispute. But the fact that the principal monuments of the Giza Plateau, the three Great Pyramids and the Great Sphinx, all lock astronomically on the date of around 10,500 BC, to me is most unlikely to be an accident. And actually, if you look at computer software at the sky at that time, you'll see that the Milky Way is very prominent and seems to be mirrored on the ground by the River Nile. I suggest that may be one of the reasons amongst many why Giza was chosen as the site for this very special place. So the point I want to make is that an astronomical design on the ground which memorializes a very ancient date does not have to have been done 12,500 years ago. If from the ancient Egyptian point of view, you're there 4,500 years ago, and there's a time 8,000 years before that, which is very, very, very important to you, you could use astronomical language and megalithic architecture to memorialize that date on the Giza Plateau, which is what we think we're looking at, except for one thing, and that's the erosion patterns on the Sphinx. And we're pretty sure that the Sphinx, at least, does date back to 12,500 years ago. And with it, the megalithic temples, the so-called Valley Temple, which stands just to the east and just to the south of the Sphinx, and the Sphinx Temple, which stands directly in front of the Sphinx. The Sphinx Temple has largely been destroyed, but the Valley Temple, attributed to Khafre on no good grounds whatsoever, is a huge megalithic construction with blocks of limestone that weigh up to 100 tons each. And yet it has been remodeled, refaced with granite. There are granite blocks that are placed on top of the core limestone blocks. And those core limestone blocks were already eroded when the granite blocks were put there. Why? Because the granite blocks have actually been purposefully and deliberately cut to fit into the erosion marks on the, we believe, much older megalithic blocks there. So I think Giza is a very complicated site. I would never seek to divorce the dynastic ancient Egyptians from the Great Pyramids. They were closely involved in the construction of the Great Pyramids as we see them today. But what I do suggest is that there were very low platforms on the Giza Plateau that are much older, and that when we look at the three Great Pyramids, we're looking at a renovation and a restoration and a enhancement of much older structures that had existed on the Giza Plateau for a much longer period before that. Actually, the Great Pyramid is built around a natural hill. And that natural hill might have been seen as the original primeval mound to the ancient Egyptians.
And the deeper this mystery goes, the clearer it becomes. The ancient Egyptians weren't just building monuments for the dead, they were building something else. Graham Hancock believes the pyramids weren't tombs at all, but machines with a purpose we've only begun to understand. This is where the story changes.
I've seen you talk about the fact that you've climbed up the pyramid 5 times. I think you've said that, right?
Yeah.
And when you go there to the Sphinx of Giza, and you're there, right? The Great Sphinx of Giza, what do locals say when you talk to them? Is there a debate of what it is?
Well, the local name is Abu al-Hol, the father of terror. But nobody can really explain why. I've asked that question.
Is there any ideas, or do they have some kind of examples of?
No, nobody's ever given me an
father of terror.
But that's how it's known. Yeah.
Have researchers given opinions why it's called the father of terror?
Not that I know of. No, it's just locally known. Anybody who lives in the village of Nazlet
father of terror in Arabic. The name is a reference of legendary Sphinx that would terrorize people by making them answer a riddle.
Yeah.
The Sphinx is a world famous monument that sits in front. So, but what
the people who live in Nazlet al-Saman, which is the village directly under the Sphinx.
Yeah.
They can't tell you why it's called Abu al-Hol.
But how do they feel about it? What's their, they're
very proud of it.
In what way? Why are they proud of it?
Because it's a beautiful, magnificent thing. It's 270 feet long. It's 70 feet high. It towers over the Nile River. It looks out due east over the basin of the Nile, and fundamentally because it is a worldwide icon. It's something that Egypt rightly is very proud of. Nobody else has the Great Sphinx of Giza. Plenty of people have got pyramids, but nobody else has got the Great Sphinx. So there's a sense of pride. There's a sense of pride for the whole Giza Plateau, that it's something special that Egypt has, which other cultures don't have.
What's the story that they tell when they're having kids and their kids go to school? What story do they tell on what happened there?
When I've talked to Egyptians, local Egyptians living in Nazlet al-Saman, they believe that the Sphinx is much, much older than the time of the dynastic Egyptians.
Really?
They believe that it's as old as time itself.
They believe it's as old as time itself. And why do they believe that?
Well, just look at it. That's why. Those erosion patterns around the side. There's a sense, a feeling of great antiquity about it. Of course, they're not looking up encyclopedias and going into the archaeological textbooks. They're just giving a gut reaction to this amazing thing.
So when you talked about what it took to build a pyramid, right? The stats you gave, you said it's 6 million tons, 481 feet high.
Correct.
You can say it probably better than that.
I'll say it exactly. The calculated weight is 6 million tons. The height is presently around 450 feet, but that's because the top 30 feet of the Great Pyramid came off in an earthquake around about the year 1300. So when you calculate the angle of slope, and it's 52 degrees angle of slope on each side, and project it further beyond the broken off top, you'll find that the original height of the Great Pyramid was 481 feet in height. Right now it's about 450.
How studied and researched is it? And what do we not, I guess the question would be, how studied and researched is it? The pyramid.
Well, I would say that this is amongst the most excavated and most studied archaeological sites in the entire world. So it's amazing that they're still finding new things there. For example, there's been using a high-tech scanning equipment, muon scanning, I believe. Just in the last 3 years, enormous cavities have been identified within the Great Pyramid, which nobody knew were there. There's a huge feature, famous feature within the Great Pyramid called the Grand Gallery. And it looks like there's another Grand Gallery above it, which has been identified by scanning, but nobody's got into it yet. Yeah, you can see it in some of those. No, that's the Grand Gallery, but you can also see the scanning there.
Zoom in, right?
There's the Grand Gallery, and above it is the Scan Pyramid's big void. Nobody knew that was there until very, very recently, and it's not the only void that's in the Great Pyramid. So we're still finding out about new things about the Great Pyramid. Now, that void could be an architectural feature. It appears to slope at the same angle as the Grand Gallery, or it might not be. It might just be, it's hard to understand why a sort of random vacant space would be left in this monument, but the fact is, all we know at the moment is that there's this huge cavity inside the pyramid that nobody has yet got into, and it isn't the only part of the pyramid. Out of the Queen's Chamber, so-called, when we call the chambers of the pyramids Queen's Chamber, King's Chamber, there's no basis for that. There's no evidence that any queen was ever buried in the Great Pyramid, nor is there any evidence that any king, any pharaoh was ever buried in the Great Pyramid, because no pharaonic burial was ever found inside it. But there's the Queen's Chamber, and on the right-hand wall and on the left-hand wall, there are 2 little shafts cut into the wall. Actually, those shafts were invisible until, I believe it was 1872, when a curious British researcher went around tapping on the walls of the Queen's Chamber. He had a reason to do that, because the King's Chamber, I suspect that's a King's Chamber one.
It is.
Yeah, the King's Chamber shafts were already known. There were shafts in the King's Chamber, and actually you could find their exit on the outside of the pyramid. You could roll a cannonball down them, and they would end up in the King's Chamber. So, but there's no exit for the Queen's Chamber shafts. But he figured, look, if there's shafts in the King's Chamber, maybe there's shafts in the Queen's Chamber too. So he went around tapping on the walls, and sure enough, he found 2 hollow points. People didn't care about vandalism in those days. He got out a hammer and chisel and just hammered them through. And lo and behold, there's a horizontal passageway, and then it's leading up at an angle. It's about that high, and that wide. Let's say 8 inches high and 8 inches wide. It's just very, very small. You can't get a human being in there. But back in the 90s, a special robot was designed, which was sent up there, sent up the southern shaft first. And what it found, after a journey of more than 160 feet, what it found was a door, a little stone door, with 2 metal handles blocking the shaft. So the question is, what lies beyond that door? A new robot was designed with a drill on the front of it. They send the robot back up the shaft. They drill a hole in that door. What do they see when the camera goes through that hole? They see a cavity about 4 feet wide and another door at the end of that, closed, shut. And of course, they've not been able to drill through that one yet. So it's the same story on the other shaft as well. So what we're getting is evidence that the Great Pyramid still has many secrets to reveal. Years of study. In some ways, you could say thousands of years of study, and you can definitely say 150 years of detailed archaeological study, have still not got to the bottom of the mysteries of the Great Pyramid. They've not solved how it was built. There are many theories as to how it was built.
But this is roughly 2,000, 2,500 BC, right? Something like that.
Yeah, that's the establishment date for the construction of the Great Pyramid. I don't have a big problem with that date. I think in the Great Pyramid we're looking at a multi-generational project. I completely reject the notion that the Great Pyramid was a tomb and only a tomb, which is what Egyptologists say. And I reject the notion that this massive, incredibly precise monument, because it is almost perfectly aligned to true north, south, east, and west, that it could have been built in the 23 years of Khufu's reign. I mean, you don't start building your own tomb until you're actually on the throne. So he was on the throne for 23 years, and that's what Egyptologists say, the pyramid was built in 23 years. I can't accept that. Nobody who's got a background in engineering and construction who I've talked to can accept that either. This thing couldn't be built in 23 years unless there was some kind of extraordinary technology that the ancient Egyptians possessed, which we don't yet know that they possessed. It looks much more likely that it was built up over a long period of time, but that undoubtedly the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty finished it off and put the casing stones that were once on the outside of the Great Pyramid. But I'm of the opinion, and again, this is just my view based on my own research and my own work, is that what stood at the Giza Plateau 12,500 years ago was the Sphinx in the form of a lion. Were some megalithic temples. There's a huge megalithic temple called the Valley Temple right next door to the Great Sphinx. Again, there's nothing that connects it in writing that connects it to any particular epoch, but it has blocks of stone that weigh 100 tons each. Those are also heavily weathered, just as the Sphinx is. So my suggestion is that on the Giza Plateau, you have a number of megalithic temples, which still stand. You have the Great Sphinx, and you had ground platforms, not very high, where the 3 pyramids were built, laid out in a very specific, very precise angle to one another. And that precise angle matches the angle of the... Yes, this is the Valley Temple, and what we're looking at there is exactly an interesting point, because you're looking at granite blocks that were put there in Old Kingdom times that face limestone blocks. And it's those limestone blocks that are behind those granite blocks. You can see them if you look right to the back. Mm-hmm. You can see the limestone blocks that haven't been covered with facing stones. So just as we believe that the Sphinx was restored by the pharaohs, we also, I'm speaking of I and my colleagues, are also of the opinion that the Valley Temple was restored by the pharaohs. But what they found was a much, much, much older monument, which they treasured and valued and venerated.
You've climbed all the way to the top 5 times, you said, right?
I have.
Now, let me ask you, when you climb all the way, are you tied to anything, or is it open like it's... Rob, can you... Because I just found a video of somebody climbing all the way to the top, and this is... Can you play this clip, Rob, the one I just sent you? So this is a fellow. I don't know who this is.
Yeah.
They posted this video. Is this literally what it looks like when you climb to the top?
You bet. That's exactly what it looks like. It's mountaineering to a certain extent. And
I mean, if you fall, you're falling.
If you're more than 20 feet up and you fall, you're pretty much certain to be dead. If you're 200 feet up, you definitely will be dead. And people die every year climbing the Great Pyramid.
How do you come down carefully? Because this is essentially 45 stories high.
Yeah, that's right. You come down very carefully. I was actually on one of the climbs that I and my wife Santha did. I was ahead, and I reached up to...
You can pause, Rob.
Some of the blocks
Right.
are only this high. Some of them are almost 6 feet high, and you have to pull yourself up onto them. The courses vary in height from course to course. And I was levering myself. I got hold of the top of a block, and I was pulling myself up onto that so that I could get my knees onto it and get on the top. When the limestone that I was holding, which was very eroded, broke off in my hands, I fell back. Fortunately, my wife was right behind me, and she pushed me very, very hard and stopped me falling. But that could have been the end of me.
I just searched right now.
Which many Egyptologists would wish it perhaps had been.
I'm sure they would. But I just searched the following, Rob. How many people died climbing the Great Pyramid? Okay. And the number shows over 1,600 people have died climbing the pyramid in the last 200 years. I can see that, because if you fall 1, 2, 3, 4, you're not going to be able to stop yourself there. I mean, that's pretty...
The slope is 52 degrees. It's a steep slope. And once you start rolling, you're gone. There's no way. And that's why people get killed.
What do you feel like when you're all the way at the top? What is there an energy you feel? Is there when you're looking around? What are you thinking? What are you feeling when you're all the way at the top?
It's a magnificent and majestic place to be. There's first of all a sense of relief. I got to the top without.
How long does it take
falling.
on average?
For me, about 25 to 30 minutes to do the climb. There was a gentleman, in fact, the gentleman who helped me with my first climb of the Great Pyramid, who's now passed away. He was known locally as Champion, because back in the 1930s and 40s, people used to run races up the Great Pyramid. And he was able to run up the Great Pyramid and do the climb in 11 minutes. Well, I'm not as fit as he was. So in my case, about 25 minutes to half an hour.
That's still good, though, to get up there in 25 minutes.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
So, okay, play the other clip, Rob. The other one that shows the inside of it, and this is just kind of giving a glimpse. This is apparently what Harvard put together. Can you get out to kind of
Well, that's a good place to be, actually. That's a good place to be, because that's that's called Mamun's Hole.
Thanks to Harvard University, you can virtually now enter the pyramid. Okay, Can you show that, Rob? Go back and play the clip, and maybe you can narrate this for us while we're looking at it.
Sure.
Go ahead, Rob.
Okay, go back to the beginning. I need to explain to you what we're actually looking at here. Can I do that?
Yeah, please go for it, yes.
What we're looking at here is the result of an Arab investigation of the Great Pyramid in the 9th century under a caliph called Caliph al-Mamun, who was very curious about antiquities. And he was already aware of other pyramids in Egypt in which the entrance was in the north face. As a matter of fact, the entrance to all Egyptian pyramids is in the north face. But at that time, the true entrance of the Great Pyramid was not visible, because all of the sides were sheerly covered sheer with beautiful polished limestone facing stones, some of which individually could weigh as much as 16 tons. They were completely covered and closed the pyramid, and nobody knew where the entrance was. It seems that in ancient times there was a way to open that doorway, to open those facing stones and to get in. But nobody knew in the 9th century where it was. So Caliph al-Mamun got together a gang of workers with sledgehammers and chisels, and he went up onto the north face of the Great Pyramid, roughly where he thought the door might be, and he started breaking his way in. And what we're looking at here is a man-made tunnel physically forced into the Great Pyramid and generally known as Mamun's Hole.
Have you walked through this?
You bet. I've walked through it more times than I can count. And that now is the entrance through which tourists enter the Great Pyramid.
What floor is this on? Is this?
Oh, it's about 25 feet up, maybe 30,
25 feet up,
maybe
okay.
30 feet up. But the true entrance, of course, has now been found, and it's a little bit above Mamun's Hole, and you can see that there are slabs of stone in a kind of that sort of shape, like an A figure, which block it. If you search for true entrance to the Great Pyramid, you can see it as well. There it's a little bit above Mamun's Hole, but nobody who goes to the Great Pyramid today goes in through that true entrance. They all go in through Mamun's Hole.
Is this what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's right. That's actually the real entrance to the Great Pyramid.
And are you actually able to go in through it?
No, because at a certain point, this is another of the curiosities, is that the internal passageway system of the Great Pyramid was deliberately blocked with gigantic granite blocking stones. So when the Mamun and his team broke in, they didn't know exactly where they were going, but as they'd got deeper into that cavern that you were showing us, as they'd got deeper into that, hammering away, they suddenly heard something very large falling in a nearby space. There was a space nearby where something huge fell. And that struck them as interesting. They knew where the sound came from. They started heading for that. And they found themselves in what is called the ascending corridor of the Great Pyramid. And underneath them, behind where they cut in, were these huge granite huge granite blocking stones, which blocked that passageway. But they had gone round them and found themselves in the passageway system. And from there, it was clear running. They could go up the ascending corridor, they could enter the Queen's chamber, they could then continue on up the Grand Gallery, and they could come to the King's chamber. That was the situation once they'd broken in and found the original system.
So what did they? So this right here, Rob. Just if you don't mind watching it one time all the way through, just to kind of get a feel.
Yeah.
Rob, if you can just play this, go forward.
What you're walking through is a man-made tunnel broken in by force.
Put it at regular speed, Rob. Go ahead.
It's a tunnel that was broken into by force, roughly hacked out of the body of the Great Pyramid, which fortunately accidentally led to this, which is the ascending corridor.
So this is not built. Man opened this up.
Yes. There's okay. The complications of the Great Pyramid are beyond belief. There's an ascending corridor, but there's also a descending corridor.
Were these stairs there, or did somebody build it?
No, those stairs have been put in modern times.
Okay, got it.
They did not exist. Let's keep on going down.
So we're going down now.
No, yeah, let's go down. Let's go down to the descending corridor. No, we're in the Queen's chamber. No, we're not quite going the right way at the moment. We're going up. But there's two ways. You can go up or you can go down. And we did see the down view. This is it. Then you come into the so-called subterranean chamber, cut out of bedrock 100 feet beneath the base of the Great Pyramid. When you come up that, you then join the junction of that and the Grand Gallery, and you can then continue all the way up to the top.
How high does this route go? Like, are you going up a lot or not a lot?
You're going up hundreds of feet at a slope of 26 degrees. And by the way, that's worth making a point of too, because the external slope of the Great Pyramid is 52 degrees. And every corridor, every passageway within the Great Pyramid slopes at 26 degrees. That's, of course, half of 52. So we know that geometers and mathematicians were at work. It's not an easy... Once you get to the Grand Gallery, it's fine, because that's almost 30 feet high. But when you're going up the ascending corridor or going down the ascending corridor, you're in a passageway, I should call it. You're in a passage that is about 3 feet 5 inches in height. Now, that means that you're going to have to bend over double, pretty much, to go down it. And what I've learned from years of exploration of the Great Pyramid is that if you're going down one of those passageways, it's better to go down backwards, because then you don't keep smashing your head on the top of it. If you go down forwards, you're going to bump your head 5 times by the time you get to the bottom. But if you go down backwards, that doesn't happen. Anyway, it's very difficult to, particularly for anybody who's unwell, to actually go up there.